So I'm here in Philadelphia, outside Philadelphia, at the inn at Villanova University, and the Teilhard and Whitehead conference has kicked off. We had a couple of keynotes earlier by Don Vinny and Ilya Delio, and I present tomorrow. I've written a paper, but I don't plan to read it tomorrow. I want to just kind of speak extemporaneously and try to zoom in on a few key points, both some convergences between these two great process philosophers, scientists, and theologians, and also on some points of contrast. But right now, I want to read the paper and sort of comment on it, and just as a way of preparing for my remarks tomorrow. This conference is being streamed online, but I think you need to purchase tickets to do so. And I'm not sure if you can still do that, but if you Google Teilhard and Whitehead conference, you'll find it. So the title of this is Process Theology in the Modern World, Science, Religion, and Christology after Whitehead and Teilhard. Start with a couple of epigraphs here. The first from Teilhard, his book, The Human Phenomenon. He writes, after almost 2 centuries of passionate struggle, neither science nor faith has managed to diminish the other. Quite the contrary. It becomes clear that they cannot develop normally without each other, for the simple reason that they are both animated by the same life. Whitehead writes in Process and Reality, philosophy frees itself from the taint of ineffectiveness by its close relations with religion and with science, natural and sociological. It attains its chief importance by fusing the two, namely religion and science, into one rational scheme of thought. So a couple of epigraphs there to get the ball rolling. Introduction. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead are perhaps the two foremost 20th century contributors to evolutionary cosmology and process theology. Whitehead's theological ideas developed as a consequence of his work in mathematics, physics, philosophy of science, and cosmology without concern for the offense they may cause to any religious orthodoxies. Still, his creative conception of the God-world relation has been heartily taken up and developed by many American Protestant theologians, and increasingly by thinkers inspired by other faiths. Teilhard, on the other hand, was a paleontologist and Jesuit priest, whose evolutionary revision of the dogma of original sin won him censure from the Catholic Church. Not unlike the sun-centric Giordano Bruno had enjoined Catholic scholastics to look again at the motions of the heavens, the omega-centric Teilhard called his fellow priests to turn their Christology away from a truncated vision of the past toward an evolutionary convergence in the future. Lucky for Teilhard, the Inquisition had by then retired its tradition of burning heretics at the stake. Regardless, his heart was already engulfed in the inferno of evolution. Teilhard composed his masterwork, The Human Phenomenon, while in China between 1938 and 1940, just as the Second World War was beginning to rage in Europe. Engaged in a battle of the spirit, he sought to share his vision of the human future. He insists, in an author's note added in 1947, and in his prologue to The Human Phenomenon, that the book is not an attempt to do metaphysics or theology, but rather phenomenological science. He attempts to offer an account of the past, not in itself, but as it appears to a contemporary human observer, quote, so that the world may be true for us at this moment. He thus seeks the cosmological conditions of human experience, a new sort of study he christens hyperphysics. It seems likely that part of Teilhard's insistence that his treatise be interpreted as a work of natural science was a plea to his Jesuit censors. He is careful to note on page 1 that, quote, beyond this first scientific reflection, essential and ample room remains for the more advanced reflection of the philosopher and the theologian. Regardless, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, ultimately refused to allow him to publish the book because of its unmistakable theological content. While I find aspects of Teilhard's scientific vision of the past and mystical vision of the future compelling, the devil, as usual, is in the details. This essay is a Whiteheadian philosophical reflection on Teilhard's attempt at a hyperphysics of the human. I will argue that some aspects of Teilhard's poetic synthesis of evolutionary biology and Christianity require metaphysical supplement, and in crucial cases, perhaps even emendation in light of Whitehead's cosmological scheme. But properly adjusted and mutually accommodated, a Whitehead and Teilhard-inspired synthesis of science and religion has much to offer anyone seeking a relevant and effective Christology for our perilous times. The next section is called Convergence and Contrast. Just checking in here to see who's joining. Mateo loves this topic. Great, glad to hear it. All right, let's continue here. Convergence and contrast. Anyone whose faith is wed to dogmatic tradition will inevitably resist novelties in speculative theology. A recent critic of Teilhard's attempt to evolutionize Christianity, Catholic mathematician and philosopher Wolfgang Smith, has argued that Teilhard's scientific claims are as fictional as his theological innovations are heretical. This is in Smith's book, Theistic Evolution, the Teilhardian Heresy, published in 2012. On Smith's reading, evolutionary theory, which he narrowly identifies with neo-Darwinism, has been refuted by intelligent design, and nothing can or need be added to St. Augustine's doctrine of original sin or the angelic doctor Thomas Aquinas' teachings on the relationship between reason and revelation. While the Church Fathers remain worthy of careful study, it is apparent that human consciousness, and with it our knowledge of the universe, has continued to evolve over the millennia. It is also important to remember that St. Thomas himself was initially a controversial figure. His efforts to integrate newly translated Aristotelian texts on natural science into Catholic doctrine met resistance from many church leaders of the time who sought to censure him. Indeed, Thomas Berry once remarked that the magnitude of the alterations proposed to Christian self-understanding by Teilhard rival those introduced by St. Thomas. In the Anthropocene, the earth itself has been transformed entirely by the application of our science and technology. In such a situation, Christians cannot but find themselves in need of a, quote, refashioned Christology to solve the apparent conflict that henceforth exists between the traditional God of revelation and the new God of evolution, as Teilhard put it in his book, Christianity and Evolution, or collection of essays. As for the general theory of evolution, which precedes and continued to be refined and complexified after Darwin, and Teilhard's poetic phenomenological approach to science, I believe Smith's criticisms can at least be qualified, if not refuted, particularly if we allow Whitehead to come to Teilhard's philosophical aid. The difficulty with Teilhard's claim to have produced a scientific treatise was summed up 60 years ago by the paleontologist George Simpson in his mostly sympathetic review of the human phenomenon. Quote, imprecision or contradiction in definition is one of the constant problems in the study of the Teilhard canon. Whitehead is recorded by his Harvard students as having made similar remarks about Henri Bergson. A shared influence on both Teilhard and himself, Whitehead takes Bergson's side in the latter's famous dispute with Einstein about the difference between duration and clock time, but Whitehead complains that Bergson, quote, phrases it so that you never can be quite sure what he means. And yet, Whitehead continues, Bergson has a merit greater than clearness, namely philosophical originality, putting things in a way which he feels and sees, whether he can make them clear or not. A similar case can be made for the value of Teilhard's vision. But can his theory of the omega point really be considered scientific? Though Teilhard calls his attempt to make others see a purely scientific project, his phenomenology nonetheless reaches beyond mere appearances to the within of things themselves. By attempting to place human consciousness, quote, wholly and completely in the context of appearances, Teilhard is turning the mirror upon the act of knowing itself. In this way, he hopes to, quote, break through and go beyond appearances to the very source of our seeing. As Thomas King says, in placing man in the framework of phenomenon and appearance, Teilhard does not mean the flat veneer of colors that strike the retinas. Rather, he wants to show the meaning that halos man when he is placed in the context of a vast cosmic movement. Teilhard sees more than the bare sensory impressions of Hume. His vision of the cosmos is one where every body, whether atomic, molecular, cellular, plant, or animal, has a, quote, internal propensity to unite. The meaning of our perceptions is in the movement of matter itself, as the, quote, subject is unquestionably no longer the human monad, but the world. The subject is no longer the human monad, but the world, end quote. Instead of cutting the mind off from reality, Teilhard nearly identifies mind and nature by showing that one can come to know the world only by being coextensive with it, or by, he says, becoming to some degree one body with it. Our minds partake in the things themselves. Our bodies are not limiting containers, isolating us from the universe. Quote, every cosmic particle, be it the smallest electron, is strictly coextensive with the totality of space-time. Bodies are rather living expressions of our interiority, as Teilhard put it elsewhere, converging almost verbatim on Whitehead's view that, quote, the human body is that region of the world which is the primary field of human expression. The convergence with Whitehead goes further. I quote Whitehead at length. The living organ of experience is the living body as a whole. The plausible interpretation of such experience is that it is one of the natural activities involved in the functioning of such a high-grade organism. The actualities of nature must be so interpreted as to be explanatory of this fact. We cannot tell with what molecules the body ends and the external world begins. The truth is that the body is continuous with the rest of the natural world. Human experience is an act of self-origination, including the whole of nature, limited to the perspective of a focal region. End quote. Though Teilhard goes to great lengths to assure the reader in the human phenomenon that the theory he lays out therein is not a work of metaphysics, case can be made that Teilhard is turning the positivist approach to science on its head. Let's say inside out. While I edit as I present. Instead of bare and meaningless sensory impressions, patches of color, measurable shapes, and so on, being the only and the most primitive form of experience from which all of our knowledge is derived, Teilhard recognizes within the human being a cosmic sense, as he calls it, or a feeling of deep connection between what is interior and personal and what is exterior and supposedly impersonal. The human being, Teilhard says, is the universe become conscious of itself. As Whitehead would refer to it, Teilhard is describing a kind of non-sensuous perception, a non-sensuous perception of the whole history of the universe coiling itself up within him. This is not a solitary introspection, where beings are only seen as closed in on themselves in their immanent operations. Rather, every granule is constituted, quote, by that which is commonly called the beyond it, rather than by its center. In other words, the immanence of the feeling of the within is part of a perpetual movement, or transience, which takes the granule in question beyond itself to become part of a growing common movement of life. Teilhard is here correcting the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, as Whitehead called it, in the thinking of modern philosophers, from Descartes to Hume to Kant. Instead of seeing the world only as it appears through the highly conceptualized, abstraction-prone mind of the philosopher, he returns to the deepest recesses of the blackness within, as King refers to it, and discovers there that it is through the most incommunicably personal in us that we make contact with the universal, as Teilhard put it in Christianity and Evolution. While there is no room to go into the details here, it will be clear to students of Whitehead's theory of prehension and account of the object-subject-superject vector of experience that his categorical scheme can bring much conceptual clarity and coherence to Teilhard's mystical insights. Teilhard the priest and paleontologist gave us a new gospel of evolution and an inspiring vision of the human future. Whitehead, the mathematical physicist and philosopher, equally aware of humanity's newly discovered cosmogenetic context, provided no less in the way of vision, but his cosmology is tempered by a radically empirical speculative method and an elaborate and revisable categorical scheme. He offers not an eschatological destination, but a way of making sense of natural science, art, spirituality, and the rest of human experience in a divinely inhabited world in process. Even if we define natural science in the expanded, unbifurcated, organic sense that Whitehead does, as the study of relational patterns evident in the nexus of entities disclosed to sense perception, including the colors of dawn and the harmonies of birdsong as much as the masses of atoms and wavelengths of light. Even if we define science this way, Teilhard's study of the human phenomenon oversteps a strictly scientific purview. He laments that, for convenience's sake, the science of his day, quote, has provisionally taken the stance of ignoring the question of how to link the two energies of body and soul together in a coherent way. Teilhard continues, but caught here as we are, for better or worse, in the logic of a system where the inside of things has just as much or even more value as their outside, the difficulty confronts us. It is impossible to avoid the encounter. We must move ahead. Whitehead was also eventually compelled to move ahead into speculative cosmology, integrating human consciousness and nature as studied scientifically within a broader organic metaphysics. But he did so while maintaining the special function of the natural sciences as a study of those aspects of experience which remain, at least hypothetically, closed to mind, as he put it in The Concept of Nature. Despite affirming that, quote, nature can be thought of as a closed system whose mutual relations do not require the expression of the fact that they are thought about, Whitehead explicitly denies that his philosophy of science commits him to any metaphysical division of mind from nature. He also leaves open the possibility that there are other ways that minds relate to themselves, to nature, and to one another that do not involve sense perception directly or indirectly. Finally, his definition of natural science as, quote, excluding any reference to moral or aesthetic values is not at all a denial of the importance of goodness and beauty in any final accounting of reality, or of the devotion to truth motivating all scientific inquiry. It's just that he would consider such an accounting a matter to be taken up in philosophical cosmology and theology rather than by special scientific investigation. I quote Whitehead from The Concept of Nature. The values of nature are perhaps the key to the metaphysical synthesis of existence. But such a synthesis is exactly what I am not attempting in this treatise on the concept of nature. I am concerned exclusively with the generalizations of widest scope which can be effected respecting that which is known to us as the direct deliverance of sense awareness. That said, Teilhard's phenomenological method can be fruitfully compared to the participatory scientific method practiced by Goethe, speculatively elaborated in the Naturphilosophie of Schelling, and later clarified and expanded by Rudolf Steiner, who edited Goethe's scientific papers. Whitehead's philosophy of organism is also resonant with Goethean science and Naturphilosophie, but he still cautions against claiming natural scientific knowledge beyond what we are aware of in sense perception. This is a check on the metaphysical overreach of any scientific materialism claiming science could even in principle explain consciousness, but also on any absolute idealism claiming a mental explanation of nature. Qualitative science is possible under Whitehead's definition, but as Goethe also cautioned, whether doing qualitative or quantitative science, we must pay due attention to the subtle interplay between observation and speculation, lest, as Goethe put it, I quote, lest our imagination sweep us away on its wings before we know our feet have left the ground. Does Teilhard really see the psychic curvature of the universe with his eyes, or is he seeing into the deeper tissues of imaginal experience, weaving us back, body and soul, to the birthplace of the all? To say Teilhard is doing speculative cosmology and mystical theology is not to diminish the importance of his achievement in the slightest, but it does allow us to maintain the practice of scientific hypothesis formation and experimentation as a distinct enterprise. Goethe could observe the life cycle of plants and the daily rhythm of the sun, allowing him to empirically describe the dynamic patterns of polarization evident in the metamorphosis of leaf and light. Teilhard cannot step out of cosmic history to see the terminus of the curve he traces from its dispersion in matter through the socialization of life into the personal unity kindling in his heart-mind. While intensely suggestive and alluring to our powers of feeling and willing, especially when connected to the revelation at the core of his Christian faith, Teilhard's leap to Omega seems, to my thinking at least, unjustified. Further, his certainty on this point undoubtedly contributed to blinding him to the ecological destructiveness of industrial technologies and the ethical horrors of eugenics. Stripped of its scientific claims and religious apologetics, and read instead as speculative cosmology, Teilhard's approach shares much with Whitehead's. Like Whitehead, Teilhard is searching for generic characteristics that apply to physical energy and living cells as much as to human thought. He seeks, quote, to discover the universal underlying the exceptional, as he put it in The Human Phenomenon. Teilhard also affirms that all energy is essentially psychic. Like Whitehead, he recognizes two poles or faces of cosmic process, what he calls the tangential and radial forms of energy. Akin to Whitehead's physical pole, tangential energy refers to the exchange of mechanical forces. And akin to Whitehead's mental pole, radial energy centers itself around the lure of the future. While Whitehead grants there is reason to suspect that nature, quote, contains within itself a tendency to be in tune, as he puts it in Adventures of Ideas, and while he recognizes a gradual movement in the evolution of the universe and in the history of civilization, from brute force to persuasive love as the primary mode of relationship, his vision lacks any hint of the necessity with which Teilhard seems to affirm the omega point. Where Teilhard prophesizes a quote definite limit and term to the elementary value and to the sum total of radial energies, Whitehead remains skeptical of any final state of order beyond which there can be no progress. This belief in a final order, Whitehead continues, popular in religious and philosophic thought, seems to be due to the prevalent fallacy that all types of seriality necessarily involve terminal instances. Red Bar likes my soul patch. Thanks, man. So now we're on the next section, which I've titled Excursus on Evolution. Bracketing the idea of evolution's end in a Christogenetic curve of curves, Whitehead and Teilhard share a sense of the time developmental genesis of the Earth and broader cosmos as essential to scientific understanding. Evolution must be integrated not just in biology, but, quote, as the guiding methodology of all branches of science, according to Whitehead. For Teilhard, evolution becomes, quote, a general condition to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforth bow and satisfy if they are to be thinkable and true. That's from the Human Phenomenon. But neither was particularly attached to Darwin's theory of natural selection as the prime explanation of evolutionary process. Whitehead does not at all doubt the general Darwinian observation that a struggle for existence means the fittest eliminate the less fit. But, as he points out, this obvious fact offers no explanation for how more complex organisms that are comparatively deficient in survival power could ever have evolved. Both Teilhard and Whitehead detect an upward trend in evolution, a great counteragency, as Whitehead calls it, to the entropic dispersion of pre-living matter that is driving the living world into greater complexity and deeper consciousness. The universe not only falls, but through its radial centers climbs toward the materially improbable, as though evincing what Teilhard refers to as an inverse form of gravitation. While it was still possible for Daniel Dennett to argue in the mid-90s in his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea that, quote, evolution is a mindless, purposeless, algorithmic process, making Teilhard's orthogenetic vision of evolution a, quote, loser among scientific hypotheses, the state of the life sciences several decades later looks quite different. Dennett's neo-Darwinian horse, while leading the paradigmatic pack for much of the latter half of the 20th century, has since lost its stride. Genetic reductionism failed to deliver on its promise to explain life. Weissman's trump card against Lamarckian ideas that the barrier between somatic and germ cells prevents any possibility of inheritance of acquired characteristics has been severely qualified, if not nearly demolished, by more recent research in epigenetics, lateral gene transfer, and developmental biology. Here I'm citing Michael Levin, among others. Rather than viewing evolution as driven by genetic algorithms, contemporary biology is coming to terms with the fact that genes are tools used by living cells, which, like all organisms, are not passive victims of fixed environmental conditions, but agents participating in their own evolution. While Whitehead and Teilhard agree that the emergence of cellular life constitutes something of a, quote, psychic mutation, to use Teilhard's terms, that bursts through to a new level of evolution, wherein reactions are no longer determined by the past, but are adapted to the capture of intensity and the clutch at vivid immediacy, as Whitehead puts it. They refrain from drawing any sharp boundaries between the living and non-living worlds. Both see the germ of consciousness already implanted in the most primordial energetic rhythms, such that, as Whitehead puts it, I quote, "The root principles of life are in some lowly form exemplified in all types of physical existence." Life thus constitutes a massive acceleration, but not the origin of the cosmic urge toward complexification of expression and intensification of experience. Teilhard acknowledges that life, quote, "can advance only by endlessly feeling its way." And he points to chirality, that is, the contingent asymmetry of certain biomolecules that is shared by all living cells, and to the fanning out of divergent branches of terrestrial biogenesis, as examples of how, as he put it, life exhausts only a part of what might have been. But his sense of the role played by possibility in evolutionary trajectories only goes so far. Where Whitehead affirms open-ended creative advance, Teilhard detects, quote, "a single rising tide beneath the rhythm of the ages, directing all life and mind on earth to its providential destination." Although Darwin is usually credited with having discovered the theory of evolution, he rarely, if ever, used the word. In fact, evolution never appears in The Origin of Species, until the 6th edition, at least, nor in The Descent of Man. Evolution, from the Latin evolvere, means the unrolling of the enrolled, the development of the enveloped. Until at least the mid-19th century, evolution was usually discussed by naturalists only in reference to what is today called ontogenesis, or the development of an individual from a preformed seed or egg. The main problem was how to account for the development of individual living beings without violating the theological truth that God's act of creation took place only once. This early doctrine of evolution held that every developing organism was merely the unrolling of something already given. The notion that species themselves changed in any way over time had not yet been considered. The theory of evolution, familiar to most 21st century students of biology, while being prefigured in the speculative writing of Descartes, Comte de Buffon, and Immanuel Kant, did not gain widespread acceptance until Lamarck, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Darwin gave it a more secure theoretical and empirical basis. Better termed transformism, the general theory affirms that animal or vegetable species have changed in the course of time, no matter how these changes are explained. As Etienne Gilson puts it in his book, From Aristotle to Darwin and Back Again. And I'm quoting Etienne Gilson, who was a Catholic philosopher, despite the fact he's written this great book on the history of final causes in the study of living organisms, and I think shares some of Teilhard and Whitehead's skepticism about Darwin's ability to explain the living world. But Gilson was also quite a critic of Teilhard. He was he had quite a bit of disdain for Teilhard's revisions to the Catholic doctrine of original sin, which he dismissed as theology fiction. But still, I think his philosophical read on the history of biology is helpful for my purposes here. So only the proposed mechanism underlying the change in species over time separates Darwin and Lamarck, who are otherwise in complete agreement against creationism. Lamarck developed his theory in a time when scientists were not concerned that presenting their work in a philosophical manner would in any way discredit them in the eyes of their audience. Darwin, in contrast, avoided the expansive reasoning characterizing such works and instead focused only on what could be derived from specific facts. Nonetheless, Lamarck must be credited with having first made the idea of transformism plausible. In his main work, Zoological Philosophy, Lamarck writes, I quote, "Since all living bodies are productions of nature, she must herself have organized the simplest of such bodies, endowed them directly with life, and with the faculties peculiar to living bodies, and by means of these directed generations formed at the beginning both of the animal and vegetable scales, and by means of these direct generations, formed at the beginning both of the animal and the vegetable scales, nature has ultimately conferred existence on all other living bodies in turn." End quote. Lamarck recognized that species are not fixed essences but changing forms. He attempted to explain the reason for the changes in terms of a variation in the surrounding environment. Here, he and Darwin are in agreement. However, Lamarck, according to Gilson, quote, "does not mean that the environment acts directly on the organism, but that it forces the organism to modify itself in order to adapt to the new surroundings." Darwin's theory of natural selection, in contrast, appeals only to a pre-given environment to explain the changes seen in organisms. The only quality Darwin saw as intrinsic to organisms themselves was the desire to survive and reproduce. Unlike Lamarck, who thought an organism adapted by making, quote, "more frequent use of some of its parts, which it previously used less, thus greatly developing and enlarging them," Darwin's theory of natural selection offers little, if any, evolutionary autonomy to organisms. The little that they do have would come via sexual selection. Under the theory of natural selection, a change in the form of a species was the result of a series of random variations selected for by a completely externally imposed and mechanical process. Lamarck's attempt to explain evolution by way of acquired characteristics, which are learned within the single lifetime of an individual due to its needs and desires, and then passed on to offspring, is still a teleological view of the world. It is similar to Aristotle's understanding of organisms, which, as Gilson put it, working from within by their substantial form, progressively shape their matter according to the type of perfected being which they tend to become. Dispensing with the idea of each species having been created ready-made by a transcendent God, Lamarck instead, I quote Gilson again, "has caused the finality of God's thought to descend into the interior of nature." We see here an affinity between the thought of Lamarck, Teilhard, and Whitehead, as each sees evolution as a progression motivated by some inner drive toward perfection. Darwin's theory of natural selection left little room for progress or for an efficacious and affective within or interiority, helping guide the development of the without. Of course, the mechanism of natural selection that Darwin discovered was in no way denied by Teilhard or Whitehead. The issue is actually rather straightforward. I quote Gilson, "Rare are those mechanists who admit that there may be teleology in nature, but exceedingly rare, if they have ever existed, are those finalists who deny mechanism and its natural function in natural beings." Indeed, what would the mechanical energies themselves be without some within to feed them, as Teilhard asks? Teilhard, like Whitehead, is at a loss to understand, even from a purely scientific perspective, how the trajectory of evolution, whether cosmic or biological, could progress without accepting some kind of fundamental impetus driving it forward from within. But again, Teilhard does not deny Darwin's mechanisms. He merely finds that they alone are incapable of explaining the plain facts. Teilhard insists that, quote, life proceeds not only by strokes of luck, but strokes of luck that are recognized and grasped, that is, psychically selected. Understood correctly, neo-Lamarckian anti-chance is not merely the negation, but on the contrary, the utilization of Darwinian chance. There is a function of complementarity between the two factors, a symbiosis, one might say. So Teilhard here describes a form of psychic selection as a complement to Darwinian selection, natural selection. I've often referred and written in other places about a form of Whiteheadian selection to complement the Darwinian natural selection, and it's a form of selection or decision on the part of organisms themselves, right, which can be passed on to subsequent generations, whether physically or mentally. There's a way in which, Whitehead's pan-experientialism allows us to really soften this division that the Weissman doctrine about the somatic cells and the germ cells really tried to, almost in a Cartesian way, enforce that division, right, so that acquired characteristics could not be passed on. Teilhard and Whitehead, along with much further research in contemporary biology, has really broken down that firewall that had been put up. So the next section, the final section, is called Christogenetic Conclusion. In addition to the integration of chance and decision, Whitehead affirms with Teilhard that, quote, a satisfactory cosmology must explain the interweaving of efficient and final causality. But to my mind, Whitehead seeks to strike a better balance between the contingency and necessity of future progress. In Whitehead's scheme, teleology is applicable to the decisions of individual occasions of experience, but not necessarily to the larger arc of cosmic or Earth evolution. Rather than imprisoning creatures in the curvature of omega, Whitehead recognizes a factor of anarchy in their self-creative decisions. Here, his Jamesian inheritance of pluralistic realism shows itself, as Whitehead resists both idealist and evolutionary absolutes in favor of a radically empirical acknowledgement of the fact that, in James's words, we live in a strung along, unfinished world in time. Still, for James as for Whitehead, once life has harmonized and become self-conscious, the question of what human beings decide to do with their earthly freedom becomes acute. I quote Whitehead, when we come to mankind, nature seems to have burst through another of its boundaries. In another sense, according to James, quote, philosophies are intimate parts of the universe, expressing something of its own thought of itself. Our philosophies swell the current of being and add their character to it. That's from A Pluralistic Universe. In the human, reflective thought breaks through the surface of biological instinct, generating Teilhard's new noospheric layer of the earth. And so, Teilhard's faith in the Christogenesis of humanity may be understood, if not as a hyper-physical inevitability, then at least as a metamoral possibility. If only we may learn to love one another as members of one body. In other words, his vision is an invitation to participate in a common faith in a future of the earth, as he put it. I quote Teilhard, for that man who recognizes Christogenesis as the end of anthropogenesis, everything in every element and event of the universe is bathed in light and warmth. Everything becomes animate and a fit object for love and worship. From Toward the Future. Teilhard offers a renewal of Christian faith by insisting that we come to relate to the divine as, first, vast and mysterious as the cosmos, second, immediate and all-embracing as life, and third, linked to our efforts on the earth, to our human efforts on the earth. The first requirement is a result of Teilhard's own experience as a scientist, learning about the immensity and complexity of the universe. As his knowledge of nature increased, his former faith began to seem childish. This tension between scientific facts and religious revelation allowed him, throughout his life, to share in the anxieties felt by so many non-believers. But like many Christian natural philosophers before him, he was able to bring together the Bible and the book of nature. For Teilhard, there is, quote, a secret message explanatory of the whole of creation, allowing us to feel God in everything we do and in everything that is done to us. That secret is that the cosmos is Christ incarnate. It is this secret that, when revealed within one's heart, for it cannot be outwardly seen, demonstrates the conjunction of both humanity's heavenly and earthly attractions. The vast universe becomes the mysterious body of God. The second requirement stems from Teilhard's plea for priests to engage more fully with the world, rather than remaining merely, as he put it, the people who bury you. He finds it imperative that the religious must not only study within religion in order to defend it, but apply their passionate religiosity to other fields, especially to science, where the disheartening metaphysical assumptions of materialism are so often the default dogma. The natural world, studied religiously as the body of Christ, becomes another source of divine revelation. As Owen Barfield remarks in a similar spirit, quote, there will be a revival of Christianity when it becomes impossible to write a popular manual of science without referring to the incarnation of the Word. That from Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances. To meet the second requirement, Teilhard also calls for a renewed appreciation of the power of love, which duty-based morality and moral theory has tended to recoil from. There is no more powerful force than love in the lives of human beings, and a religion that does not embrace its transformative potential has no future. The third requirement is related to the second, but is aimed specifically at the potential otherworldly tendencies of Christianity, concerned more with the salvation of separate souls than with the evolution of the whole earth. Earthly life cannot be understood as a mere passage to the next world. There is nothing more important in Christianity than the incarnation, the entrance of the divine fully into this world. It expresses God's willingness to suffer and die for the redemption of every creature and for creation as a whole. In order to feel at home on the earth and to take responsibility for its flourishing, it is also important to remember that what is below is like what is above, that eternity participates in time, and that matter is spirit in nous. Humanity, barely conscious of its own role in the matter, finds itself in the midst of one of Earth's major evolutionary transitions, a decisive moment whose window is closing. If we find a way to have faith in the future, we may feel that the presence of Omega is already with us, luring us onward despite the apparent improbability of success. According to N.M. Wilders, in his book, in his foreword to Teilhard's Christianity and Evolution, the central concern of Teilhard's Christology is the problem of secularization. Religion has not been able to keep pace with the psychosocial transformations precipitated by modern science and technology. Whitehead also noted the urgency of the philosophical task of secularizing the concept of God's functions in the world, as he put it in Process and Reality. Nearly a century later, this task remains. To the extent that human beings need meaning as much as food to live. The task is now something of an emergency. Modern people generally lack an intellectually convincing and ethically motivating vision of our purpose on this planet. Consumer capitalism is happy to fill the void, if only it could. The point is not to pretend to offer some deductive solution to the world in the vein of, say, Hegel, but rather what Teilhard refers to as a cluster of axial lines of progression. One of the most striking convergences in Teilhard and Whitehead's thinking concerns their shared intuitions about how theology must shift from imagining God as impassive substance to God as relational process. In Teilhard's terms, he seeks to replace the traditional scholastic metaphysics of being with a metaphysics of union or unification. He grants at least the initial pole of God a self-subsistent unity, which he describes as haloed by a necessary circumference of multiplicity or creatable nil, which, I quote, by passive potentiality of arrangement or unification provides a possibility of being, a prayer for being, a prayer which it is just as though God had been unable to resist. That's from Toward the Future. Teilhard could here be said to have rendered into poetry Whitehead's metaphysical account of God's primordial envisagement of eternal objects, which, as Whitehead says, are abstracted from his commerce with the world, but this primordial envisagement is yearning after concrete fact. Teilhard goes on to describe the requirements of divine creation or actualization of passive possibilities in terms that again correspond remarkably well with Whitehead's notion of God's consequent nature. Quote, this is Teilhard, in order to create, God has inevitably to immerse himself in the multiple so that he may incorporate it in himself. No creation without incarnational immersion, Teilhard says. For Teilhard, as for Whitehead, God does not create by fiat, but by magnetic influence, to use Teilhard's phrase. God's initial aim at unification reverberates within every unit. Quote, as Whitehead puts it, in unison of becoming with every other creative act, luring each creature toward what would be most beautiful for it by reflecting its greatest potential back to it. Both account for evil in the same way, by admitting that God is not all-powerful in the sense that he might forcefully contend tit for tat in the disputes of finite creatures. How a creature decides to respond to the divine lure is out of God's hands, though whatever happens, God will love what can be loved in it, dismissing the rest into triviality. Despite these resonances, Whitehead's account of a dipolar divinity offers no hint of the providential progression evident in all Teilhard's writing on the subject of Omega. Unlike the primordial nature, which despite knowing all possibilities has as yet no one else to know with, Whitehead describes the consequent nature as a growing consciousness and fellow sufferer. Making one last effort at convergence between these two leading lights of process thought in the last century, might we then say that the intensity of God's consciousness and power of love depends in some measure upon our human willingness to participate in personalizing all our earthly relations? Can we co-evolve on purpose while steering clear of eugenics, a temptation that Teilhard, to my dismay, seems to have fallen prey to? Doing so will require an as yet unachieved coordination among each of our highest ideals: the goodness of religion, the beauty of art, the justice of politics, and the truth of science. The essential criterion of truth, according to Teilhard, I quote, is its power of developing indefinitely, not only without contradiction, but such that all its partial statements form an ever more complementary whole. In Whitehead's terms, I quote, Truth itself is nothing else than how the composite natures of the organic actualities of the world obtain adequate representation in the divine nature, which evolves in its relationship to the evolving world without derogation to the eternal completion of its primordial conceptual nature. There can be no determinate truth, correlating impartially the partial experiences of many actual entities, apart from one actual entity, God, to which it can be referred. So God, whether perceived as real or conceived as ideal, thus plays a crucial role in human evolution, not as sole creator out of nothing of an entirely unnecessary creation, but as common mediator and creative goad within a multifarious world in process. In Teilhard and Whitehead's Heart Minds, God becomes the shared referent of all finite truth claims, infinite in her capacity to instigate novelty and to swell with love as she embraces the good that emerges. And yes, I've shifted to use the feminine pronoun. I see there's some conversation going on about gender and transgender stuff in the chat here. And I just figured, Whitehead and Teilhard both refer to God as he. And I think we want to maintain this personal dimension of the divine. And so using personal pronouns is hard to avoid. Like saying it just doesn't quite do it. And so I figure I may as well just sort of shift from the masculine to the feminine pronoun to indicate that God contains both of these aspects. Teilhard and Whitehead offer not only a theological intervention upon outworn dogmas stunting human growth, their work is also a theological invitation to a scientifically informed and mystically inspired love of evolution and a common faith in a future of the earth. So that's it. How long was this? Where's my timer? 57 minutes. Yeah, so that's way too long. I'll be trying to summarize this tomorrow morning, or actually, no, I speak after lunch. Let me just catch up here a little bit. Gosh. Huxley. Interestingly enough, Julian Huxley, I believe it was Julian, was quite a fan of Teilhard. Yeah, the transhumanists have definitely taken up Teilhard's thought, really emphasizing the optimism he had about technology. Teilhard was so optimistic about the trajectory of evolution and anthropogenesis moving towards new genesis, nuogenesis, the emergence of this thinking sphere of the earth. And it's very easy to read into his speculations about the future, this idea of what we now call the internet, which is fair. I wouldn't want to deny that connection, but there's a way in which Teilhard was so confident in this arc of evolution and the direction that it was headed that he was very willing to sacrifice the earth and just accept that, look, the human being will form this new technosphere and this noosphere, this planetary consciousness that will, it's going to use up the biosphere and the lithosphere and all the rare earth minerals and leave the physical basis of the planet as a burnt out cinder. But for Teilhard, this was okay because the real trajectory of evolution was into this spiritual dimension. And while he calls himself a pantheist sometimes, or tries to develop a kind of Christian pantheism where he equates God with evolution, there's a way in which the emergence of the noosphere, and certainly of this process of Christogenesis, that there's somehow some kind of transcendence from the physical world. And the achievement of some kind of immortality, whereby we wouldn't be limited by the physical resources of the planet and the living world. And I'm not so sure about that. I think obviously the Earth has a finite lifespan. Even if we were to miraculously, human beings were to miraculously develop a more quote unquote sustainable way of life, a sustainable civilization, we're not going to be able to sustain it indefinitely, no matter how, ecologically attuned we were, because of what? Entropy, right? And the sun is going to go supernova at some point, and long before that, it will have, heated up to such an extent that we'd have a hothouse Earth. And so it's not clear that our goal should be to sustain existence on the Earth forever. We need a deeper sense of some kind of transcendence. I'm just not sure about Teilhard's optimism in this sort of gleeful rush into a technological future that drives all other species into extinction. Because for Teilhard, it's, once the human being has been found, once thought has emerged on the Earth, like all the life that came before it, he seems to think was just preparatory. And, there have been efforts to correct this ecological blindness in Teilhard's thought, principally by people like Thomas Berry and Brian Swim. And I think that's important. I understand, his view of the relationship between matter and life and mind, and this process of evolution leading towards deeper consciousness and more complexity. But I feel like we need to be more cognizant of this process of, transcending, but always including what came before. And I'm just not sure that the noosphere can sustain itself independently of a healthy biosphere. And so that's our real challenge here. And Teilhard doesn't help us with that. Teilhard doesn't offer us much in the way of an ecological worldview. And so, there are some aspects of his thought that I find challenging that I didn't really go too deeply into in this paper. But we'll see if it comes up tomorrow. Thanks for the audience, everyone. I think I'm going to sign off shortly. Oh, Jeff is here. Hey, Jeff. Does resurrection figure into the trajectory? For Teilhard, I don't think so. I mean, he's really revising Christianity in some deep ways, though in a way similar to Barfield, he's convinced that there's a sort of hidden evolutionary cosmology already implicit in Christianity. I mean, it is such a historical religion, right? And there is this developmental process as if you read through the biblical narrative, and the shift that occurs with the incarnation, which was in some ways prefigured in the Old Testament, but everything takes on a new light once the incarnation occurs and the resurrection occurs. And Teilhard's just reading this in an evolutionary way, but what would the equivalent of resurrection be? I mean, he does want to affirm a kind of immortality for human souls, which is part of his reasoning around the noosphere and this future achievement of evolution, achieving some independence from the physical earth. He wants to be able to affirm a kind of immortality for human souls as well, beyond the death of our physical bodies. But it's not clear to me how he does that, particularly given his affinity for pantheism and the intimacy of relation he wants to affirm between spirit and matter. As I mentioned earlier in this paper, Teilhard, like Bergson, who Whitehead loved, but also complained about never being quite clear enough or precise enough regarding, his underlying metaphysical affirmations. It's beautiful poetry, but it's not always consistent. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question. I do think, just still riffing on this idea, Jeff, that Teilhard was one of those 20th century figures that was beginning to develop a kind of etheric perception. Steiner predicted that this would happen, being able to see with the imagination, not just with the physical eyes, into the sort of time dimension of nature. And I think, Teilhard had developed this vision. I think it's clear in his writing, but I don't think he had worked it out fully, nor did Whitehead. There's plenty of deep mystery that remains, and lots for us to continue to work through. But I do think that Teilhard is one of the primary examples that comes to mind for me when I think about who could exemplify what Steiner was sort of predicting, that this etheric imagination would come online in the 20th century. Yeah. Anyways, I think I'm going to call it quits for tonight. Thanks for listening, everyone. Catch you later.